Okay, today we're going to talk about narrative nonfiction. So, the first thing I wanted to do was give you a little definition. Narrative nonfiction is a kind of nonfiction writing that uses literary styles and techniques, things like characters, plot, conflict, setting, those kind of things, to create factually accurate narratives. So, the book is true and it's factual, but it's told like a story. So let's get started with some recommendations. This book is called Notorious RBG. It's the life and times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's a Supreme Court justice. She's never asked for fame. She only tried to make the world a little bit better and a little bit freer. Now, you would think that a biography of a Supreme Court justice would be dry as dirt. But the authors of this book use a really light and airy touch to make a really vivid portrait of a woman who has become an internet sensation and a cultural icon. All across America, people who weren't even born, like you, when Ginsburg first made her name as a feminist pioneer, are tattooing themselves with her face. They're setting her famously searing dissents to music. They're making viral videos in tribute to her. All kinds of stuff. Now, this book covers that stuff, but it also follows her life story and her career as a judge. Trust me, this book is anything but boring. Have you ever had a pen pal? This pen pal relationship started as a homework assignment. The book is called I Will Always Write Back: How One Letter Changed Two Lives. Everybody in Caitlin's class had an assignment to write to an unknown student somewhere in a distant place. Martin was lucky to receive a pen pal letter. There were only 10 letters sent to his school and 50 kids were in his class, but he was the top student, so he got to pick the first one. And that letter was the beginning of a correspondence that spanned 6 years and changed both of their lives. Caitlin's a pretty typical American middle-class teenager, kind of like kids here in Hayworth. And she began writing to Martin, who's a 14-year-old boy from Zimbabwe, and he lives in the slums. And in her letters, Caitlin describes her life, which isn't all that different from what many of you have here in Hayworth. It's full of sports and shopping and movies and video games and fun times with her friends, quarrels with her friends, days at school. But Martin was initially pretty private about his responses because his life is very different. And even finding money for postage is a struggle for him. And staying in school, which required paying costly fees, became almost a dream for him. So it's really the story of these two kids who are a continent apart, and what do they have in common to write about and talk about. And the nice thing is this book flips back and forth between Caitlin's chapters and Martin's chapters, and you'll see what they have in common and also some of their major cultural contrasts. And in the end, you're going to understand how they become best friends through their long-distance letter exchange. The next book is called Hidden Girl. You may think that slavery is something that ended with the Civil War, but you should think again. Because when Shaima Hall was 8 years old, her impoverished parents in Egypt sold her to pay a debt. Now, this just happened a few years ago. 2 years later, the wealthy family that she had been sold to moved to Orange County, California, and they smuggled her into America with them. Shaima has been serving the family for 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, until she was 12. And that's when an anonymous call from one of the neighbors brought about the end of her slavery. But the story isn't over because she's never been educated from the time she was 8 until she was 12. She's illiterate. She cannot speak English. She can't even tell time. So school is an ordeal. The foster homes in which she gets put in are often very problematic. If you want to find out what happens to this girl, it's really dramatic, and it's a true story, and you should try this book. This book is called Inside Delta Force. If you'd like to learn about the military, then this book and the other military books I'm about to mention are really the ones for you. Inside Delta Force describes the Army's most elite, top-secret strike force. You will not hear about their heroics on the news. You will not see any headlines about them, and no one, not even their families, can know who they are. On paper, they really just do not exist, but without them, our lives wouldn't be the same. So, this book takes you into the grueling selection and training process of these men. Um, Everything from learning how to open a padlock with a soda can to rescuing a hijacked airplane. These men are masters of espionage and warfare. Like I said, this isn't the only narrative nonfiction book we have on this topic. I would also like to recommend these books. First one is I Am a SEAL Team 6 Warrior. The next one is The Making of a Navy SEAL. The third one there in the left-hand corner is Navy SEAL Dogs, My Tale of Training Canines for Combat. So that's pretty interesting with the animal angle. And the final one is called Ghosts of War. It's the true story of a 19-year-old GI who is sent to, I believe it's Afghanistan. So all of these are firsthand accounts of the training and war experiences of many of these men and women. The next book I'd like to talk about is one I really like. Have you had the flu recently? If so, maybe you better not read this, but I can't resist because I really love a book about some kind of rampaging illness that's about to wipe out the entire population. Weird but true. This is a true story. It takes place in 1793 in Philadelphia. And at that time, Philadelphia was the nation's capital, and it's being devastated by an apparently incurable disease whose cause is unknown. Well, it turns out to be yellow fever, and the illness is devastating the city's residents. And this book really brings the horror to life. You have to remember, they don't have the kind of medicines and antibiotics that we have today. So this is a major epidemic, and the author relates it to some of the political events of the day and to the 18th century medical beliefs and practices. And it draws on firsthand accounts written by people who were there. And the author really spotlights the heroic role of the free Black people that were living in Philadelphia and how they helped combat the disease. And it also follows a little bit of a constitutional crisis because President Washington he was forced to leave the city and all of his papers behind to escape the deadly disease. You would think that a science book about the fever's causes and cure might be boring and ho-hum, but this is really suspenseful and graphic, and it really will have you on the edge of your seat. How many of you have been to see the movie The Greatest Showman? Well, this book will tell you the real story of Mr. P.T. Barnum. It traces the man's roller coaster life from his boyhood in Connecticut to his early career as a creator of one of our country's most famous museums, which is like sideshows, and to his later role as the master of an enormously successful circus. He wins and loses several fortunes along the way, and the whole book is just packed with photos and letters and more. And if you like this one, you might like this one too. It's another circus superstar, Tom Thumb, the remarkable true story of a man in miniature. Charles Stratton was born in 1838. He was a perfect baby in every way, but then he stopped growing. At age 4, he was just over 2 feet tall. He weighed only 15 pounds, which was the same size he had been as a 7-month-old baby. That was about the time that P.T. Barnum named him Tom Thumb and put him on display, touring him all around the world as a curiosity. Now, Charlie was a natural performer, and he became enormously popular and very wealthy, more so than any other performer before him. So in this book, you're going to learn all about his life and adventures, and you might also ask yourself some challenging questions about what constitutes exploitation, both in the 19th century and today. Here's a fun book if you like board games. The book's called It's All a Game, The History of Board Games from Monopoly to Settlers of Catan. And it's going to show you why board games have been with us longer than even the written word. What is it about games that captivates us and all the way into this age where we're all into our smartphones and instant gratification. But in this book, the author is going to open the box on the surprising history and psychology of board games. And he does it in a really interesting way. He traces the evolution of games all across cultures and time periods and continents, from the paranoid Chicago toy genius behind classics like Operation and Mousetrap, all the way to the role of Monopoly in helping prisoners of war escape the Nazis. Bet you didn't know that. This book ultimately reveals why board games have captured our hearts and minds all over the world for generations. You should roll the dice and give it a try. Let's talk about narrative nonfiction books about sports. They're amazing. They combine information about the sport with the thrill of the game. So I'm going to recommend several, and the first one here is about basketball. It's called Eagle Blue, the story of a team, a tribe, and a high school basketball season in Arctic Alaska. And the book follows the Fort Yukon Eagles through the course of their entire 28-game season, from their first day of practice in November to the Alaska State Championship tournament in March. The author really climbs into the lives of these 14 boys and their families and their coaches. He shadows them right through the Arctic winter of 50 degrees below zero temperatures and around-the-clock darkness as those Eagles crisscross Alaska in pursuit of their dream and their village's dream. Because basketball isn't just about the team, it's about the community as well. Want some more sports action? How about this book? It's called One Shot at Forever, a small town, an unlikely coach, and a magical baseball season. Hey, have you ever been to Macon, Illinois? Well, in 1971, the Macon, Illinois team was playing with hand-me-down uniforms, and it's the 70s, so there were peace signs on their hats. But they defied convention, and they defied the odds. Led by their English teacher, who had no coaching experience, the Macon Ironmen emerged from a field of 370 Illinois teams to represent the smallest school in Illinois history to make the state final, a distinction that, by the way, still stands. These high school athletes play a dramatic game against a Chicago powerhouse that would change all of their lives forever. And I'm not going to tell you who wins. Here's another sports book. If you think baseball in Macon, Illinois is close to home, how about baseball in Bloomington Normal? This is the story of someone many of you have heard of. His name is Michael Collins, and he was killed just a few years ago by a drunk driver in Bloomington, Illinois. And that tragedy inspired the whole pay it forward movement that we're all very familiar with. In the book, the team, which is U-High, discovers that no adversity on the field can come close to what they've already experienced when they lost Michael. The coaches, the players, the parents, everyone learns the power of one team playing with a purpose that's bigger than the game. And the season ends where they never could have imagined on that first day of practice. Another sports book, Fourth Down and Inches, Concussions and Football's Make or Break Moment. This book is really interesting. It starts out in 1905. When that football season ended, 19 players were dead and countless others were critically injured. The public was outraged. Now today, football is facing a new injury crisis that's as dire as anything that happened in 1905. With increased awareness about brain injury, reported concussions are on the rise among football players. You guys probably know this, but experts fear that concussions may be only the tip of the iceberg. The injuries are almost invisible, but the stakes couldn't be higher. The brains of millions of young football players across the country are at risk. This is a bone-crunching journey through football's origins and the latest research on brain injury. Oh, and speaking of brain injury, here's one of my favorite narrative nonfiction books. It's called Phineas Gage, a gruesome but true story about brain science. And seriously, people, if we can make a story about brain science thrilling, then this genre has really got something going for it. I love this book. It's a fascinating look at a guy named Phineas Gage, who back in the 1800s, he was a railroad construction foreman. And he was blasting rock in 1848 when a 13-pound iron rod was shot through his